Well, hey, welcome to the Light Reading Podcast. I'm Jeff Baumgartner, a senior editor at Light Reading.
Hello, I'm David Evans, Head of Asset Recovery and Services for the TXO Group.
Great. David, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have an opportunity to speak to you. So today we're going to talk about something that's been in the news of late, the decommissioning of aging copper networks as some telcos pivot to higher performing fiber and wireless options. And it's been an ongoing trend, but we've seen some specific projects and activities bubble up. I think the big recent one, of course, is AT&T, which announced that it plans to shut down copper-based services across most of its U.S. footprint by the end of 2029, and then just this week, the week in which we're talking, Brightspeed announced some activity around its copper services. It's going to use Verizon's wireless network to deliver fixed voice and internet services to some of its DSL areas, including those that will eventually be upgraded to fiber and those that maybe do not factor into their upgrade plans. But of interest, though, is AT&T, when they did their announcement, they did note that they're going to resell. Part of the project is to resell copper assets as they're decommissioned, and I think that's where TXO comes into the discussion. So, David, let's start big picture. Just give us a brief overview of the company, and then maybe shift over to the role you're playing, in helping telecom players decommission their copper assets and prep them for resale.
All right. Well, so as a business, we are a global business. We've got our locations in the UK. That's where we were founded, 2005. We've then expanded into the US. We've got offices in Germany. We've got offices in Sweden, France, Australia, Brazil. Anywhere where there's a telecom operator, we're quite interested in being the local option. We serve the operator as the main part of our business, but we do support the OEMs and the carriers, and we empower them to self-spare, look after their networks, sweat those networks, recover those networks. So that's the immediate link back into copper. It's our physical engineering, it's our expertise in reuse, it's the circular economy and sustainability-driven metrics. Sustainability is one thing, commercial is another. And if you can marry those two, that's where you become a friend to the operators. So our core business is repurposing assets from one and selling to another. So the likes of AT&T would buy assets from TXO, and we may well be sourcing them from the likes of Telia in the Nordics, or we may be sourcing them from Verizon in the US. It doesn't have to be from one end of the world to another. And there's a few, there's quite a lot of what we do. Being local is helpful. Local means we can physically recover. We can physically ensure that those assets are good. And then there's the trust aspect. We have to make sure those assets work. For an operator like AT&T to maintain its network, they need to know that those functioning assets are not a waste of their time and money. So that's the maintenance aspect. We offer network and engineering. We typically have ex-staff who get made redundant as networks shrink. They are the best people for these operations, because they'll walk onto site and they'll say, that is good to go. And the BT, for example, we're well publicized as one of BT's major exit supporters, as we are in Germany. Deinstallation from field is a huge topic. But if you've got the team in the room that says that's probably safe to recover, and the question from the operator is, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, because I put it in. That's a really good bit of history to lean on and expertise. So if we bring that out in-house, we help the operator to realize the release of that asset, which essentially releases revenue as a result, which is a huge driver. And it's not just recycling, it's repurposing somewhere else in the world if there's a market. So as you talk about AT&T's exit plans from copper to fiber, it does release a part of the world that would be buying copper assets from us. And it's an enormous revenue stream. You see,
Right.
Let's see. Sorry, did you?
Yeah. So we're talking about copper assets. So we're not talking just about cables in the ground, right? We're talking about other parts of the copper infrastructure. Yeah. So, kind of explain a little bit about that ecosystem, right?
Well,
As
it
an
is.
operator is decommissioning. Yeah.
It is. We are interested in the cable, but we're also really interested in what's attached to said cable. So if there's switching equipment, you talk about POTS in the US, we call it PSTN on this side. What is that equipment doing? Is there services running on that equipment? And there is. That nobody in the US has successfully exited copper. So who is supporting an equipment type installed in 1960? And it isn't Nokia and it isn't Cisco. So how are you doing that? So that market of end of support or end of life legacy hardware, that's an enormous market because there is services to be withheld or upheld. And that's a big part of our market. And it isn't just for us as a business. It's not just the 1960 install base. It's the current ASR 9000 where manufacturing shortages create gaps in the market for us. So it's both ends of the scale. But as far as copper is concerned, there is still a service that is running on that from the UK to the US. So copper exists.
So do you, in a sense, like help take over the operation of that, or kind of how? I want to kind of understand your role, right? With let's say there's a telco that's like, well, we want to decommission eventually, but we do need to kind of operate this for a set amount of time while we're making a conversion.
Yeah. So that would be migration services. So we would be involved in migrating traffic from one to another. And that it's in our interest to do so because that enables the equipment to be released. So again, that's expertise from either the OEM or from the operator themselves, plugging them back in with the TXO hat on and helping them to help their old employer. So if you look at it from a Vodafone perspective, we may have an engineer that will help support a migration of traffic from one site to another, frees up that location, releases the equipment, releases the footprint, releases the copper, releases the hardware, the switches, the routers that were carrying traffic but were underutilized as now can be resold or repurposed elsewhere and frees up the real estate. So we go from migration services through to power down to physical recovery of that asset, to testing, to selling, to recycling, to smelting, if that's what the end goal is.
Yeah. So explain the smelting part. Is that the where you're kind of deconstructing it, or what's that process? Yeah.
So when it comes to the bare metals, that's one thing, but every TXO location globally has what we would call a recycling line, which it's probably, without disrespecting the guys who work on the line, it's the uglier side of our business. Not looks at all, but probably where the loudest music is. It's probably the most fun aspect of the business. But these guys are deconstructing cables. They are cutting them to size. They are bringing them back to base metals. That could be stripping. It could be granulation, or from a card perspective or a router perspective, it is bare metals. It's precious metals constructed to a state that is fit for smelting, or an optional would be bioleaching, or there are lots of new innovative ways of getting to the precious metal, which essentially is the end goal for revenue, where there is no intercompany reuse, no global reuse, and no resale channel. If you haven't been through that, don't entertain the recycling because you could be missing a massive market.
I see. So is that just part of the education process with some of these telcos to kind of understand, hey, this portion of your legacy infrastructure can be reused, resold, and here's a portion that maybe doesn't have any future use. So let's talk about the recycling option.
Yeah, that's perfect. So some operators will be paying for very large support contracts with original equipment manufacturers, and I won't name them, but you know who they are, and they will say, we'll support that platform for the next 10 years. And as and when you have faults, we'll send you a replacement. Those fault numbers are low, and the ticket prices are high. So it's taking the control back. What's the firmware? What's the software upgrades? What's the firmware upgrades on a 17-year-old card? There isn't any. It's forgotten. So what's the premium for? And in fact, we've just gone from 7,000 sites to 5,000 sites, which means you've got 2,000 sites of equipment we could repurpose. Can you help us with that? Yeah, I can help you to self-spare, become self-reliant, not depend on supply chain crisis, not depend on chipset shortage. Nobody can say that. And actually get to the control aspect. Look after yourself with what you've already paid for. And we've got the ability to do for the testing perspective, the migration perspective, and the actual trust that it's going to work. Because that's the biggest fear. That downtime on network is worth nothing compared to savings of asset recovery or revenue generation. You take a network down for 2 days, that's the end of you from a brand perspective and the network revenue. So it's that trust aspect, and 85% of the telecom operators trust us to do that. Not all the way, sometimes just a little bit, but we're getting to a point where we create spare part management solutions across legacy platforms that then enter newer platforms. And in parallel, we fund the whole thing by generating revenue from recovery and resale.
I see. When it comes to the resale side, I think you have warehouses all over the world. So do you effectively create like a catalog of equipment that you've been able to recapture and be able to resell from a lot of these telcos and make it available to others that might need it?
Yeah. It's a commonly asked question, actually. Can I take a quick look at your catalog? And we sit on just shy of 1 million parts in stock currently. And that sits in, can you imagine how boring that catalog would be if you were sat on the settee reading a catalog of 1 million parts? But what we use is a software called iTrack, and it's essentially an online asset management portal. So you log in, you view all assets held by TXO, whether it's in Brazil in our Sao Paulo office, or whether you log into it and it's in our North American office in Baltimore, for example. It doesn't matter to you. You have one window into your stock held by TXO that we may have recovered locally, or we may have repurposed in Sweden. If it doesn't matter to you where you see that asset, we've moved it or we've held it locally to support your needs. But when you log into iTrack, you can see your stock, which could be, some of our operators have got 70, 80,000 parts in stock that they have got on resale through TXO. But whilst they're doing that, very often they go, is that in our stock? We're buying them currently. Why are we selling them and buying them? It doesn't make any sense. Well, because engineering didn't ask you, planning didn't know you needed them. So we give them a window to say, actually, that stock's yours. And they say, well, actually, we need them. And that happens every day. And we've got that as a callback function, as a safety net. But as they do that, they say, how many more of them have you got from others? So we've got the ability to access that stock tool to say, I also want to look at Telefonica stock. And I'll say, you can't know who it's from, but you'll just see an anonymized stock. And you'll see.
It doesn't attach it to a specific operator that used it originally?
No. That, from an anonymous perspective, we've got that confidentiality agreement to say we can't advertise who we sell on behalf of. You can't, I only want to buy stock from John because he's my mate and he runs Virgin Media next door. We can't do that. But yeah, it's about being trusted, and a lot of our operators do speak to each other and they will say, we've actually got that on stock. But that's fine, but that's not our role to do that. But best part about that is that you call back 2 because you didn't realize you needed them, and then you've logged in and seen that there's 7 others in TXO stock. So then you can buy them. So you use it as a fulfillment tool. So given that access to operators is enormous.
Okay, now there was a big round number that was shared that TXO believes, like that the extraction and resale of copper infrastructure could be worth like $7 billion to the telecom sector. So I'm assuming that's a worldwide kind of figure and covers all. I'm assuming it's not just copper in the ground. So when you're talking about that kind of a figure, can you maybe offer a little bit more color on how you arrived at that figure? Is it all of that infrastructure that can be repurposed and resold?
So this was the Financial Times update,
I see.
where a number was shared in what we probably estimate the market will be worth in 2025. There was a slight rounding up piece on that one. So we've estimated within the next 15 to 20 years that you'll probably see 1 million tons worth of copper that will come out of the market. And that's not that complicated. When you look at the likes of Openreach in the UK, they're currently sitting on 200,000 tons worth of copper in the ground. That's serving the UK market. 200,000 tons. If you extracted that today at the current market rate, which is I think is about $7,000 or $8,000, there's your first number. I won't do the maths live, but we can.
Yeah, we don't have a whiteboard and a calculator for you, but yeah, I think
that'll be quite good. It'd be like an episode of what is that? We have that. I can't. Rachel Riley will be here to correct what I'm going to say, but if you look at 1 million tons of copper, it's 6,000 pounds, which is what we're looking at today. That adds up into a significant number. If you split that over 15 years or 20 years, you'd be looking at 400 million pounds per year. You translate that into dollars, but that's if you can get it out in that year, and you can't. And there's an enormous caveat around that. The reason AT&T haven't recovered, you had it in one of your articles I was reading. Was it the how and why, or the how and when the AT&T piece? You talked about them having 88 million wireline locations. Okay, take them out. What's it worth? They're live. They're running something. So you can't exit it. And there's a second caveat to that. Who's to say you could even get to it? Because that's what we find in a lot of our customers, in Germany especially, is that it's buried. And that buried copper is the cost of extraction worthwhile. And it is on current rate. It is on current rate. Should the market disappear, we won't see as much of a positive recovery rate. But you see JP Morgan saying that it's going to hit some ridiculous numbers. We're looking at $16,000 by the end of the year. I think they're one of their stats. Well, that's quite exciting, because you will see in the news there are some financiers who are buying exchanges or telecom operators' equipment and then leaving it sat. So what you're buying there is an appreciating mine, essentially. If your money is going to continue to appreciate, why move it? Just leave it where it is. It's sat in Spain. So there is a little bit of that, but there is
some market dynamics, that factor in when and how you might get to that. Yeah, I didn't think about that. Okay.
But those dynamics, they are there. And in the next, if AT&T hit their targets, that copper will be available. So the 1 million tons comment, to get to that number published to the FT, that's not hugely out of whack. If you think about the Bloomberg number, I think that was, what was that, 7 billion that was mentioned. These numbers are achievable, but the equipment has to be available. The traffic has to have been migrated, and you have to be able to remove that copper that isn't tied to fiber, that takes out an enormous amount of your revenue stream. There's a lot of numbers linked to that, but it's not unachievable at all.
Okay. Now the AT&T announcement, I thought was kind of an eye opener in a way, because it represented a recent major example of a telecom operator doing this kind of project at this kind of scale. But as you look at the market in general, has the rate of interest and activity related to copper decommissioning projects been picking up of late? Is it pretty steady? I was just kind of curious to understand the trend in general that you're seeing.
It's definitely picking up. I think when you see operators like AT&T or BT or Orange, they're transitioning to the fiber. They are doing that, yes, because it's faster, it's cheaper to run, from an energy perspective, that is a plus. But they are seeing the lucrative returns. And when they do it, it does create almost an excitement in the market for their peers to say, well, what if they're making that revenue? I want to make that revenue. So we are seeing an upturn, and that upturn is linked to, yes, big players like AT&T announcing it, but also the copper media drive. I used a reference recently that the streets are not paved with gold, they're paved with copper. You're walking over copper every day, you're walking under copper every day. You're surrounded by an asset that is carrying very little traffic. Why is the focus not on turning that into revenue? So that for us works very well. We are seeing a surge in copper prices. We are seeing the big financiers saying that surge in demand will outweigh the mining ability. So where are we backfilling it? Well, the telecom market is an enormous player in that. So I think the higher the price, and if I give you a reference, when we used to collect copper 20 years ago, the reason that was happening is because they would migrate and they would slightly downsize the exchanges, or the COs that you would call it, central offices. Those were small-time recovery, and the cost of copper then was so low that engineers were paid for their time with the copper they collected from site. If that was today, I'd be really keen to be a copper recovery engineer, because I reckon from a team of 2, you can probably recover 1 to 2 tons a day. If a team of 2 can do that, you're probably earning about $7,000 each a day. That's great.
It's a nice project. Yeah. Doesn't sound like a pretty lucrative line of work. Yeah.
You need to get in the gym. This stuff is not light. This is the issue. This stuff is heavy. This stuff is complicated. And the risk, and this is, I think, that's probably the biggest caveat around this. The risk of network downtime that's not a thing. You're not allowed to play with that. So the reason why you'll see a steady incline, not a sharp boom of this, because it has to be done properly. You have to ensure that the traffic on existing networks are fine. And you will see things like we saw UK published a delay in the PSTN, or the POTS power down, because there is no live alternative to the red line service, which is the people in need or the elderly have these necklaces or this wearable tech where you press a button and it alerts your copper line and it calls an ambulance if you've fallen. In the UK, we've seen, well, we won't put that on TXO, but we've seen cases where people have pressed those buttons and no help has come because the migration has happened in the background and it hasn't been communicated. And that has then halted that plan by 2 years.
So, I see, because they need to get that lined up, before they can push forward. Yeah. Yeah.
Are you actually, I know you did the AT&T article about that, what do they call it, the AT&T phone? I was reading about your...
the alternative option that they developed, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that phone advanced piece with the 24-hour backup offering a similar feature. That's great, because that's the type of product that you need in that market, that is backed up by non-copper based technology, so that you can migrate away without a danger to life, without a danger to service. It's uptime. That's good, and it's good to see that that's actually an AT&T product. So I imagine the revenue line is quite exciting on that as well. But that's a really good article. I like that one.
Okay, great. Well, the last thing I wanted to ask you, we talked a little bit about the dynamics in the market for copper will play a role, in how aggressive telcos might go about pulling it and reclaiming it, putting all the other aspects aside. But where's the demand right now for copper coming from these days? If it's being resold, who's actually doing the buying right now outside of the telco world? Who's picking up all this copper?
I would ask you, do you drive an electric vehicle?
I do not, but I know plenty of people who do. Yeah.
If you consider the range of an electric vehicle, that's probably 300 miles, or which is great. 300 miles is excellent if you've just paid $10 to charge your car. But if you drove $300 in a straight line, 300 miles in a straight line, you couldn't, because the chances are the infrastructure hasn't been built to suit an electric vehicle charging station.
Okay.
So for us in the UK, we're seeing the trend is majorly in building the EV network. So copper demand is on the rise, but copper is used in more than just electric vehicles. It's the demand spike is driven by that. If you read certain articles, they will drive the EV piece. But actually manufacturing is huge. Copper isn't going anywhere. The mining of copper is slowing down. They're seeing what we call an urban mining method. So what we do from recovering from the urban mine, as in COs or exchanges, that's 13 times cheaper than extracting from the mine. And there was a few stats that we published recently around how many tons of copper ore you would have to dig to get a ton of copper. And it's drastically less than what you'd have to do if you were urban mining. And urban mining sounds a bit cool, doesn't it? But it's purely just recovering from field in a safe manner.
That's an interesting. Yeah, but it's a good label. It does kind of cover what you say. Yeah, it's an easy label to kind of cover that aspect of it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So EV is the major driver in the EU, especially.
All right. Well, great. Well, I think that's where we're going to leave it for today, David. So thanks so much for joining the podcast and offering some valuable insight about what TXO has been doing in the world of copper, retirement, and reclamation, and everything else that's going in that market. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, lovely. Thank you for the time. Enjoyed speaking to you.
All right. Thanks, David.
Thank you.